on the question. It being 5:30 p.m., the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Orders of the day. Order du jour.
Private members' business. Consideration of motion M36 on Emancipation Day, standing in the name of Mr. Jowhari.
Just one moment. Just hold that thought for a moment. Mr. Jowhari, seconded by Mr. Fergus, moves that the House recognize that A, the British Parliament abolished slavery in the British Empire as of August 1st, 1834. B, slavery existed in British North America prior to its abolition in 1834. C, que les abolitionnistes.
C, that the abolitionists and others who struggled against slavery, including those who arrived in Upper and Lower Canada by the Underground Railroad, have historically celebrated August 1st as Emancipation Day. D, the Government of Canada announced on January 30th, 2018, that it would officially recognize the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent to highlight the important contributions that people of African descent have made to Canadian society and to provide a platform for confronting anti-Black racism.
The heritage of Canada's people of African descent and the contributions they have made and continue to make to Canada, and that, in the opinion of the House, the government should designate August 1st of every year as Emancipation Day in Canada. Debate. The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today in the House to speak to my motion M36, which would have the House formally recognize August 1st as Emancipation Day, and in turn maintain our government's commitment to highlight the contributions people of African descent have made to Canadian society and continue to combat anti-Black racism today. This motion builds on the incredible work done by Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard with Bill S-255 in the last session of the Parliament. Motion 36 on Emancipation Day, Mr. Speaker, as you mentioned, when passed, would have Parliament officially recognize the abolition of slavery on August 1st, 1834 in the British Empire, including British North America, what we know as present-day Canada. The role of British colonies, including our nation, in participating in the transatlantic slave trade. The abolitionists who laid the groundwork for change and defied the norms of the time. The history of Emancipation Day, including the many untold stories and unsung achievements of Black Canadians in Canadian society. And finally, to address anti-Black racism in the context of United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent and for the purpose of achieving our goal of justice, inclusive, and equal society. Mr. Speaker, in 1807, the British Parliament voted to end transatlantic slave trade. And on August 1st, 1834, chattel slavery was abolished across the British Empire and all its Commonwealth territories, including Canada. This was a landmark victory for Black community across British Empire, and especially for Black Canadians who organized, rallied, and fought for this legislation. The day has come once of celebration amongst Black Canadians who expressed their joy at being able to live freely and independently, though it also stood as an important occasion to reflect on the struggle it took to achieve that freedom. Emancipation Day allows for Canadians of African and Caribbean descent to connect through shared experiences and gives an opportunity to pass on the stories of their enslaved ancestor whose names and experiences would otherwise not be recounted or honored in any history book of that time. While recognition of Emancipation Day is at the heart of this motion, one of the primary pillars in education and awareness should be highlighted. Mr. Speaker, this summer, in the weeks leading up to Emancipation Day, I had the opportunity to consult with various advocacy groups regarding this motion. I want to highlight an Emancipation Day panel I attended with notable Black scholars in Canada, including Honorable Jean Augustine, the first female Black Canadian Member of Parliament. One of the key highlights I took from this event was the importance of education. This motion's primary purpose is to continue to educate our community on Canada's history and culture, as well as shed light on part of our history that we have not always acknowledged. It also presents us with a unique opportunity to learn about important Canadian Black historical figures, community leaders, and trailblazers. Mr. Speaker, the history of Emancipation Day goes beyond the abolition of slave trade. It should highlight the work of numerous Black scholars, activists, and change makers. We specifically want to acknowledge the historic event like the Underground Railroad, where tens of thousands of African Canadians, African Americans bravely escaped slavery in the South and sought refuge in Canada from 1850 to 1860. And we want to recognize influential Black Canadian abolitionists and cultural leaders like Mary Ann Shadd, the first female newspaper publisher in Canada and the first Black female publisher in North America. Shadd founded and ran the Provincial Freedom from 1853 to 1860 and was a fierce anti-slavery activist. She used her platform to showcase Black culture and explore political and human rights issues, such as abolition, women's rights, and the right to vote. She later went on to establish a non-segregated school in the town of Windsor. Or we should probably recognize Viola Desmond, a Nova Scotian businesswoman who was arrested in 1946 for sitting in whites-only section of a theater. She was later charged with tax fraud. This incident became a catalyst for change as she refused to succumb to the racist policies of her time. Her case sparked the civil rights movement in Nova Scotia and inspired a generation of Black Nova Scotians and Canadians to fight for justice and human rights. We must also acknowledge the Black Canadians who played a pivotal role in Canada's effort during World War I. Despite facing discrimination and barrier to entry into the armed forces, a significant group of Black men dedicated themselves to the war effort and served in multiple combat and support roles. For example, we should honor the number 2 Construction Battalion, an all-Black military unit that dug trenches, defused landmines, stocked ammunition, and removed wounded soldiers from the battlefield. The contribution of the number 2 Battalion were not recognized until much later at the war. In the words of Senator Bernard, Emancipation Day served as an instrument to pass on the history and the memory of those who went before them, and as a beacon for taking up the responsibility to carry on from where their ancestor left off. Mr. Speaker, since immigrating to Canada, I've been lucky to live in many diverse and multicultural ridings like Richmond Hill. However, I have seen and experienced the effect of racism, prejudice, and discrimination in my own daily life. I know that I can never know the struggle of Black Canadians in our society today. but I believe it is our duty as allies to emphasize and to continue to educate ourselves on issues that continue to impact Black communities across the world and in our country, Canada. Throughout the month of July, my office created a social media campaign entitled We Remember. This online campaign highlighted the stories of Black Canadians throughout history who have made important contribution to our society. Canadians whose stories were not told in our history books and our school classrooms. Mr. Speaker, my hope is that this motion be the first step in acknowledging the gaps in our education system. It can encourage a greater focus on Black history and the inclusion of Black Canadian stories in history and social studies classes. Emancipation Day today is a time for all Canadians to look inward and unlearn the biases and behaviors associated with the history of slavery that have resulted in the underrepresentation of Black Canadians in history books, school curriculums, in elected position, and public service. It also serves as an opportunity for us to dismantle the remnants of institutionalized racism, discrimination, and the overrepresentation of Black Canadians in correctional facilities. Recognizing Emancipation Day gives Canadians the opportunity to confront this reality and to advocate for greater diversity, inclusion, and opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge the support that this motion has received from my colleague, Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. Senator Bernard's guidance has been essential in allowing me to approach this motion with the care and the nuance it requires. Senator Bernard has been advocating extensively for this cause and continues to be a fierce advocate for Black communities across our country. I also want to thank the member from Hull Aylmer, the chair of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, and members of all party Parliamentary Black Caucus for their support on this cause. I want to commend the valuable insight from community voices like Rosemary Sadler from Royal Commonwealth Society, the Ontario Black History Society, and the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Mr. Speaker, their guidance and assistance were key to bringing visibility to this issue. In the honor of Emancipation Day and the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, I'm calling all Canadians to come together to confront our nation's history with racism, as well as emancipation, so that we can achieve better outcomes and representation for people who are marginalized, a label which disproportionately includes Black Canadians, as well as First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. Mr. Speaker, as for myself, I continue to advocate for a more inclusive, culturally aware, and diverse society in which Emancipation Day and its history are represented and embodied in our schools and our institutions. In closing, Mr. Speaker, it is my sincere hope that all Canadians, and especially the members of this House, will join me in exploring our nation's history, and next August take part in their community's Emancipation Day celebration. Please support M36. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.